It's an honor to be here this morning to celebrate this capstone event with all of you. I'm grateful for the warm welcome of our hosts, esteemed guests, practitioner fellows, and my keynote partner, Matthew, who I hope to get to meet in person at some point, but am very happy to be with you here remotely today. I'm especially proud to be invited to join a gathering created by the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America, whose stated mission supports research, performance, art, and scholarship on race and ethnicity to help build greater understanding and a more just world. Building a more just world is an idea that merits repeating. The work you all do as artists and scholars, in essence, culture creators, matters deeply and makes a profound difference in moving the world forward. This occasion reminds me of the words of multidisciplinary Indigenous artist Merritt Johnson, a descendant of the Mohawk and Blackfoot people, when she says, "I feel responsible for speaking to the way things are and to envision a possibility for the future with ourselves in it, as we are and as we can be, in positive ways." She echoes Octavia Butler's insight of writing ourselves into the future. I'm a painter, drawer, and printmaker, and I aspire to apply all the creative intelligence I can gather to engaging issues of history, place, and identity within the context of race and ethnicity. I'm helped in that work by my artistic ancestors, artists that have persevered over hardship and left a legacy of excellence to follow. Two of my most treasured artistic ancestors are James Baldwin and Romare Bearden. Baldwin was not best known as a poet, but I'm particularly moved by his poems from the collection Jimmy's Blues. His words are still speaking to the present moment. The invitation to participate in today's event introduced me to Bearden's importance to poets through the anthology Bearden's Odyssey. Thank you, Matthew, for that elegant framing of image and word. I have often quoted Bearden to my students, noting, "The artist has to be like a whale, swimming with their mouth wide open, absorbing everything until they have what they really need." I take this approach to heart in my own practice and know that I have much to learn from my contemporaries and students. By recognizing the intergenerational wealth of collective experience in this very room, we are all richer for it. Freely sharing that wisdom, we are made more human and humane. We are building a more just world. I've also been fortunate to come from a family of storytellers, elders that knew the value of passing along personal histories that cultivated the imagination. Their creative talents were equally expressed as good cooks and gardeners, stylish dressers, as well as storytellers, and provided the models I needed to understand the importance of embodied culture. No high art, no low art, just lovingly applied craft through whatever materials or means were available. In 2018, a print series, Nakarima, grew out of ruminations on my father's life. Those works reference a network of mid-20th century social clubs, Nakarima clubs, or the NAC, for Black Americans in the Midwest whose members, including my father, gathered. This intentional inversion of the word American references the binary reality experienced by Black Americans, described as double consciousness by W.E.B. Du Bois. The reversal of American into Nakarima also speaks to the exclusionary nature of white supremacy, a target of the club's name that went unacknowledged by the dominant culture. This distortion of the status quo was subtle enough to avoid a backlash against the club's patrons, who understood its subversive intent. Creating a gathering space for Black people's free expression to sing, To dance and to be in community was also a radical act towards building a more just world. Other series in my oeuvre include Black Tears and Deconstructed American. I began Black Tears in 2014 in the wake of Michael Brown's murder and in response to James Baldwin's writing about racial injustice in 20th century America and the impact of the oppression that followed. I was struck by the parallels between the state-sanctioned violence that Baldwin spoke about decades ago and the continued violence inflicted upon Black bodies today. The widespread protests against these incidents have given voice to our country's collective sorrow. As I reflected on this communal expression of grief, I began drawing Black Tears as a way to contemplate my own sadness. It soon became a meditative act, a process that allowed me to grieve and to create a visual elegy for the loss. To date, this series is composed of over 800 individual ink drawings that, when exhibited in mass, embodied shared mourning and commemoration. A more recent body of work, Deconstructed American, is a text-based collage series that questions the word American as a unifying identity. Large, hand-drawn letters that are repeatedly print, cut, and recombined to form multifaceted patterns as pieces are arranged to align or contrast. In this way, numerous perspectives on belonging, or not belonging, are presented as an emblem of nationality as fragmented and recomposed. In the process of making this series, I often thought of how each letter form, however contorted, retains a distinctive integrity, perhaps a parallel for Americans' identity. And though there is little obvious resemblance between my collages and those of Romare Bearden, his aesthetic sensitivity to balance, repetition, and emphasis are lessons that inform every composition I create. He was an expert at joining form and content. In an upcoming project, I will be exploring the Great Negro Migration through family history and considering once again the ways an individual story can be a microcosm, reflecting a collective experience that shaped not only the Black community, but America as a whole. Like some of you, the northern migration of over 6 million Black people impacted my own family in ways that are both obvious, like living well above the Mason-Dixon line now, and less so, like charting subtle changes in attitude over a span of decades. I vividly recall my father's stories about the South when it was the South, as he characterized the shifting circumstances of time and geography. I believe place makes us who we are. I will travel to my father's birthplace in the Mississippi Delta, which will be a first for me, and learn more about how that place made him, and then made subsequent generations from those that fled and those that stayed. I will do this research and creative work with an artist's sensibilities that I believe I share with many of the practitioner fellows here today. A respect for the agency of materials, an eye for the poetic in the everyday, an appreciation for the diversity of human experience, and a feminist perspective. Like any good research project, the outcome is not predetermined. The artwork that comes of my exploration will yield a narrative told through abstracted images that reflect one story of the Great Negro Migration. And though it is specific, it will not be unique. It will be precious, but not rare. Most of all, our stories must be shared because together we are building a more just world. Thank you.
I'm really excited to be even remotely a part of this community for the moment. So thank you all for having me. And thank you, Toby, for those really, really elegant and beautiful words. So let me dive in here. Because we cannot separate life from art, and because a life in America is inherently a racialized life, race is a central feature of art in America, whether or not one wishes to accept it. As such, this topic is vast and nuanced and takes on all the myriad complexities that any human life must. But let me spend a few minutes here ruminating on some present thoughts on the topic, specifically how it relates to poetry, my own artistic area of practice. Let me begin with a framing of poetry given to us by the great theoretician and poet Aimé Césaire, who once wrote, quote, "Poetic knowledge is born in the great silence of scientific knowledge." If we take this framing as one starting point of how we come to poetry, how we begin to think about the production of what he calls poetic knowledge, we can quickly, especially in an American context, begin to see the way that poetry can serve as a countervalence to the scientific knowledge that brought us so much of the insidious ideologies of biological racism that permeate our thinking to this day. Poetry becomes the nuanced and the local news, the unearthing of the lived and the felt, the expression of the actual in light of the official, which we can also often call the fictional. Take this poem by June Jordan from her last poems, 1997 to 2001. This is a poem called A Couple of Questions, written, as I've said, by June Jordan, and it was dedicated to a poet by the name of Derek Gilbert, more commonly known as D Knowledge, who passed away at a fairly young age. A couple of questions. How many Indians? How many Indians left? How many Africans? How many Africans now? How many Indians? How many Indians left? How many Mexicans? How many Mexicans here? How many Chinese? How many Jews? How many Jews anywhere? How many? How many Catholics? How many queers? How many Indians? How many Indians left? How many Muslims? How many Muslim women and girls? How many Indians? How many Palestinians? How many? I can't handle the numbers, who run the lottery on what percent of who ends up dead on the street, and what are the odds that a drive-by shooting will take out a 2-year-old and her 15-year-old mother? Or what is the cost of an LAPD surveillance helicopter or anti-personnel armored vehicle for use in situations of civil unrest? And how many people listening to these questions do not have a clue? How many? How many Indians? How many Indians left? How many minutes, how many hours before we agree that loving ourselves does not require hatred of somebody else? I have some place to go and candles to light, and I live 3,500 miles and 3 time zones away from the only lover in the world who can keep me awake when I'm actually fast asleep. And all of this hatred sorely aggravates my soul. All of this hatred aggravates my soul, and hate will not obliterate 3 time zones plus 3,500 miles of unadulterated baby, I'm here by my lonesome self reality. And so I'm trying to handle this math. I know it's a fact. You can't take a political meeting to bed. It's a fact. And there are these other several happy things I want to find out about instead, like, when will you love me enough to move just a little bit closer? Or my imagination of the snow that knows the furnaces of the secret of your face. But regular life feels difficult, feels fleeting, and not what anybody serious could describe or categorize as safe. And so how about a political meeting? A really big marathon meeting of everybody tired of the president, the governor, the armies, the Marines, the cops, and white supremacy and racial purity and religious and gender crusades? How about a meeting of about how many would you say today? How many Indians? How many Indians left? There's little that scientific knowledge can express to us about Black life in the way Jordan does here, that can tell us about the way history resonates and permeates our visceral response to the everyday worlds we navigate. And here it occurs on multiple levels. The way Jordan is responding to the statistical calculations of death and destruction, twice subjugated, first by the victims of those numbers, then by the living who must calculate them. We see the layered ways in which the poet creates that poetic knowledge Cesar alludes to, a knowledge that contradicts the scientific impulse that drives those statistics, an impulse that at its best is a glossing, a generalization, or an observation from what we know to be a very distant gaze. Here, Jordan gives us the intimate reading of that knowledge, asks the questions not being asked. Poetry then becomes not just a necessary gap filler, but a fundamental resurfacing, a layer upon which to stain the glass in an effort to find a more suitable color. And of course, one can extend this framing to all art, perhaps enlivening the human engagement from a different angle or set of senses and interactions. In this way, art becomes an indispensable action in the larger conversation about race and ethnicity. It becomes a practice, a doing that is not simply a privilege, but a necessity. The activist and educator, Dr. Dudley Flood, who was on the front lines of the earliest desegregation movements in the education systems in North Carolina, once said of his activist work that with any action, you must ask these questions. What may happen if we do? What will surely happen if we don't? And I think we all know well what will happen if we don't. What will happen if we fail to tell our lives from our own positions? So what might this mean for us in this moment? Now, I will concede that no matter the aesthetic, at its core, poetry is about a revealing in one way or another. It is always a kind of telling, and in this, of course, nothing is more essential than the teller. But a thing I've noted of late is the way in which identity is used as a catalyst for narrative, an idea that at its core we likely all agree is needed, the thing people so often like to call diversity. Of course, we need diverse voices, and I, for one, have been a significant champion of such things throughout my career. But what we seem to be falling short on is the way these voices are catalyzed and, dare I say, even chosen. There's an explosion of diversity happening in the poetry world now, a thing my generation began to see the early waves of after the significant and groundbreaking work of folks like June Jordan. But what I'm also seeing is how that work is so often mediated, relegated, and shaped by a group of gatekeepers that still do not reflect the full telling I allude to. In this, fairly little has changed. We see a significant number of Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian, so on, voices entering into the literary landscape, but they're largely ushered by white editors, publishers, and agents who, behind the scenes, are curating elements of the narratives we read in a way that continues to feel very singular. The larger collective and context of who those writers are and what traditions and communities they come from is so often missing. Their stories are still commonly told as exceptional, and exceptional by whom we need not ask, told in a framing of rampant individuality that does not consider the histories they embody, that does not hold them as members of a collective, but instead as the anomaly that have made their way into the company of true artists, of tastemakers. It is, as we know, the oldest story of success, one of the tokenization and bootstrap narratives, one as tired as the narrative of manifest destiny that underpins it. We can look no further than the majority of book reviews we see these days that spend ample time discussing the identity and life of the artist, as seen through the white gaze most often, but so little time engaging the work itself. It is for me a reminder of my own experience as a writer when my white editor assigned to my first book said, "I don't know that I'll have many editorial notes for you because, your work is full of cultural references that I just don't understand." This was said in the tone of the best white liberal traditions, the lilt of "I wish not to offend." But for a young writer, were it not for my own community who could engage my work critically, what I received was a missed opportunity to strengthen my work. What I witnessed then and witness now is a diversification, to again use that loaded term, coupled with an acceptable abdication of responsibility. It's the college brochure with the Black and brown faces on the campus with the Eurocentric curriculum. In this way, I think we need a more concerted effort, and we're thankfully beginning to see this change, not just of the artists we engage, but the underpinning systems and structures that allow that art to come into the world. It is not enough to simply bring in more writers from various backgrounds. We need to create spaces where their work is being supported, challenged, and contended with on its own terms, outside of the cultural knowledge frame that feigns universality when it often means Eurocentrality. And this fundamental shift is the most difficult work because in the spaces it occurs, it signals permanent change, redirects the institutional reality from one that is engaging in the moment to one that has pivoted its paradigm. What I'm speaking to here is the necessity to fundamentally shift power, not just the choppy surface of the water, but the undertow that drives it, that drives to change power at the level of publishers, editors, curators, gallerists, agents, and donors sends many into panic. We know the challenges this kind of shift will face, as even with the nominal changes we have seen, we're inundated with the cries of how we have lost all standards and the accusations of the great melanin takeover, or the refrain I so often hear, white men can't get published anymore, insinuating the foolish notion of reverse racism, or as Barner Hesse once argued, the absurdist conclusion of reverse racism that white institutions and white people racially discriminate against and exclude white people. We know, as Hesse claims, this is absurd, and we need look no further than their own statistical knowledge, as Jordan alludes to. As of 2019, the publishing industry remains 76% white. Editorial departments became even more white than before. Quote, the percentage of people in editorial departments who self-identified as white increased from 82% to 85%, end quote. And literary agent demographics are in line with the rest of publishing. As one study stated, quote, comparing apples to apples, there's still no change. And in the visual art world, a Mellon study of the same year noted 72% of all museum staff are white, and at the level of intellectual and leadership positions, those making the decisions, the number climbs to 80%. But here we find ourselves at a critical moment. A moment where if we want to see real and lasting change in the art world, we must move beyond the individual artist and their access and accolades and heed the words of historian Robin Kelly when speaking about the Academy. He said, quote, if you're going to have ethnic studies, you have to be prepared to rethink the reproduction of knowledge and who does it and how they do it. If not, don't bother, end quote. For us, the reproduction of knowledge is codified not just in the art, but in the spaces that support it, award it, hold it, publish it, and deliver it to the world. And I, like Kelly, believe that if we are not serious about that wholesale change, why bother? Thank you.